Today we're going to start our coverage of JavaScript. JavaScript is sort of the third main language of web development. I don't know. I don't want to rank them. I don't want to say the third, but it's the third one we're going to study. And it's the third one that comprises web pages. Let's talk about what JavaScript does, first of all, and then we'll show some examples of it, and then we'll build an example or two of it. So, remember back when we discussed forms, we discussed about there being a client and a server. And a client was someone that was running a web browser. And they're connected to the internet. And also connected to the internet are a variety of web servers. And we talked about how in the case of plain old HTML static web pages, we described that the client makes a request through the internet, it makes it to the server finds and delivers the static HTML. Which consists of HTML, CSS, and also JavaScript. I don't know if we mentioned it at the time, but JavaScript is part of that package that gets delivered as a completed web page. Or let me rephrase it, it can be part of that completed web page. And we discussed how there's server-side scripting, which can do things like take input and combine with data from a database. And create on the fly for the user a finished web page that consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In that case, the scripts are not HTML and CSS and JavaScript, but they produce the output of them. So there's like a C# program, any of you that have taken C# that writes web pages. Or there's a Java program that writes web pages. Or there is PHP programs that write web pages and so on. When you use a script on the server side to write and create web pages dynamically, again, remember dynamically means it changes. It changes based on the user's input, maybe based on the user's location, maybe based on the time of day. When we talk about a page that changes without programmer intervention, we're talking about server-side scripting. And in which case, what's on the server is not completed web pages, but programs to write web pages. But in all cases, the client still gets delivered HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. JavaScript itself is a programming language. And what it does is it gets delivered with the web page and it allows the clients to interact with the web page. By interact, I mean that the user does something and the page does something in response. And it does that without having to go and reload a new complete web page. For example, if we do a Google search, we type in our search term, we click submit, a whole new web page gets displayed. That is a server-side page that was created for the user based on being submitted to the server. JavaScript interactions occur without going back to the server. And here's why that's important. Even though connecting to the internet is very quick, especially these days, it still takes a little bit of time to go through the internet. If you have a bad internet connection or whatever, if the server is busy, it could actually take a little bit of time to load up a web page that comes from a server. However, if the code is delivered with the HTML, that code lives on your machine, which means there's no time or virtually no time for that code to execute. It executes very, very, very quickly. And you don't have to redraw the whole web page. You just change the parts of the page that you want to change. Let me give you an example of that. Go to ESPN.com. So we go to ESPN.com and this page loads. All right. This page consists of HTML and CSS, but it also contains JavaScript, which means that we can interact with the page. An example of the interaction is like this. We put our mouse on one of these menus and a menu appears. We can look and see what the scores were yesterday, or click on the Cleveland Browns, or do whatever we want to do. We take our mouse off of that menu and it disappears. Likewise, it does that with NCAA football, NHL, NBA, Major League Baseball, and soccer. Notice that happens instantaneously. There's not a load time associated with it, like when we request an entire page. So even though that happens quickly, you can still see it takes a little bit of time for that page to be displayed. Whereas this menu displays instantly. Why? Because the code to create that menu was downloaded along with the HTML and the CSS. So therefore, it's already, as soon as the initial page loads, it's already on the client, which means it can execute instantaneously. We get that sort of seamless interaction. We don't have to wait for the menu to appear. It instantly appears. These three technologies work together. And by three technologies, I mean HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The HTML is the page's content. It's the links that are created. It's the text that is created, the images. All this, the buttons, links, text, and so on, videos. All that is the page's content, and all of that is done in HTML. The CSS is responsible for the appearance and the layout of the page. So we've seen how those two things work together. Yes, we have a bunch of links, but what makes those links appear on the left side of the page? That's CSS. What makes this appear on the right side of the page? That's CSS. What makes it expand when we make the mouse bigger or smaller, or finally get to one column like that? CSS does all that. So both the appearance of the page, how it looks, the fact that this is that color gold, the fact that this is blue and bigger type than normal, all that is controlled by CSS along with the layout of the page. So what does JavaScript do? JavaScript is responsible for the interaction. Of the page. We have this little triangle here. By interaction, we usually mean that the user does something, or put differently, something happens, and the page responds to it. And again, here's a great example of that. User puts their mouse on something, instantaneously a menu appears. So let's consider each of these things in this example, and let's talk through. The actual links home, scores, schedule, individual teams. In this case, the links are in HTML. Why? Because that's the content of the page. What does CSS contribute? It originally makes those links invisible. And then other things about the appearance are controlled by CSS. Finally, what does the JavaScript do? The JavaScript shows and hides the links. So these things, three things working together form the solution and form the package that the user gets when they download this page. All right. Let's build our first JavaScript example. And I have some examples out there that we'll look at some point, but I want to start with a brand new, fresh example. So let's go into Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to start and I'm going to put in everything that needs to be on the web page, starting back to the first day of class. Dot type HTML. HTML. Head. Body. We're going to call this our spoiler example. Because what we're going to do is we're going to put on this web page some spoilers for Star Wars. All right. Try to make this a little bit complete. Who is Luke Skywalker's father? And of course, we know it is Yoda. Just kidding. All right. So if we display this HTML, this is the content that's going to be on our page. All right. If we display this HTML, go and save it on the desktop as spoiler. If we display this page, this has the content that we want. If I can find it. Go. And I'll make the text bigger so we can read it. Who is Luke Skywalker's father? Yoda. Well, that's not much of a spoiler, right? We can see it right away. We might want the spoilers to be hidden so that we can either look at them or not look at them. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use CSS to make this invisible. All right. So I am, just for this example, going to put the CSS code right in the HTML. It's typically always better to put the CSS in a separate file. But again, just to make, so I don't have to switch between files, I'm going to put the CSS code in the same file. And I'm going to say, I want this paragraph to be invisible, right? How do I make something invisible? Well, I can make it invisible a couple different ways. One of the ways I can do it is I can display visibility. I can set the visibility attribute hidden. The other thing I can do is I can set the display type to none. But what do I want to do that for? Do I want to do it for every paragraph? No, because every paragraph would hide this too, and I only want to hide the spoiler. So I have to either put a class or an ID on this. Now, thinking ahead, it's possible I might have more than one spoiler on this page. So I'm going to make this a class. Give this a class of spoiler. And anything, any paragraph with a class of spoiler, I'm going to say the display is none. So we don't have it. We can't see it anymore. So HTML is content. CSS is the appearance. So initially we want that spoiler to be hidden. So we make the display none. If I did this for I add another spoiler and I keep the class of spoiler on it. Second spoiler is invisible too. All right, so I did that. What about the interactivity though? How do I make spoiler text appear? Well, we could do this a bunch of ways. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a button on the form. All right, well, I'm going to put a button on the page. I'm not sending this to the server, so I don't really have to make this a form. So I'm just going to put a button on here, and I'm going to say input type equals, and I'm not going to say submit because we're not sending this to the server. We're doing this all in the client. We're executing the client-side code. So I'm going to say type equals button. Value equals show spoiler. So we do that. There's our button. When we click the button, nothing happens. Okay. What we have to do is we have to fill in with the JavaScript that's necessary to show the spoiler. So I'm going to do that right here. On click equals, well, I have to say what spoiler I want to show. Do I want to show this spoiler or this spoiler? Well, I only want to show this spoiler. Therefore, I have to give an ID because I want to show one specific item on the page. So I'm going to do ID equals spoiler 1. So my onClick is going to have a little snippet of JavaScript code that's going to show that spoiler. So I'm going to write the statement in here. I'm going to demonstrate how it works. And then we'll dissect the JavaScript statement and look at it in detail. The JavaScript statement to show that spoiler is going to look something like this. Make sure I did it correct. I don't have any typos or anything. Document, get element by ID, spoiler, style display block. It's good to me. Displays it. Do the same thing for the other spoiler if we want. We'll give it an ID of 2, spoiler 2. Now we have a page that initially hides the spoilers, hides that piece of content via CSS, contents in HTML, the initial appearance of the pages in CSS, and then we have JavaScript to show the spoiler. Now let's look at the statement a little bit closer. First of all, the entire JavaScript statement is included within double quotes. Even before that, we have onClick. OnClick is what's called an event. It's something that can happen, and most events relate to something that the user does. Sometimes there's events like when the page initially loads. That's an example of the event. What are all the different events? Well, we can look them up. And on change, on click, on mouse over, on mouse out, on key down, on load are the common ones. Here's all of them. There's a bunch of things that we can do. We're going to stick to the most common ones, and one of the most common ones is on click. The word on before it means when this happens. When the user clicks this button, this is what I want to do. And that JavaScript statement is in double quotes, indicating that this is what I want to do. So the next thing we do is we use what's called the DOM, D-O-M, or Document Object Model. The Document Object Model is the way that JavaScript points to different things on the page. So what we're doing is we're kind of zooming in on the thing of the page that we want to change. The word document means that the thing that we want to do, the thing that we want to change is somewhere on this web page. Now you might think that that's a given, but it's actually possible if you pop up another window that you can actually change something on another web page. But we're not doing that, so we want to change something on this page. What do we want to change on the page? We want to change the thing on the page that has the ID of spoiler 1. Get element by ID is a function. And a function is something that you can call and get the results of and use the results. So get element ID, what that is saying is, what do I want to change on the page? Well, it's somewhere on the page, and specifically, it's the thing on the page that has an ID of spoiler 1. That's this paragraph here. Notice that the spoiler 1 is enclosed in single quotes. All right. It's important to do that because we're using double quotes to indicate the beginning and end of the statement. If we use double quotes inside of here, that would confuse the browser, and the browser would think this is the end of the JavaScript statement, and it would blow up. So we want to change the thing on the page as an ID of spoiler. What do we want to change about it? We want to change something about its style. What about the style do we want to change? We want to change the display property. Right? Remember the display property of the page initially for everything with the class of spoiler, the display property is set to none. Well, we want to change that. What do we want to change it to? We want to change it to block. So it will display it as instead of not displaying it all, it will display it as a block tag, which means it displays it, with a new line after it. So we're zeroing in. We start by looking at the web page. Then we look at the thing on the web page that we want to change. Then we look at the thing on the web page that we want to change more specifically. We want to change the style. Finally, the display value, and then equals block. This is an identical statement down here, except we're finding the thing that has an ID of spoiler 2. So we're showing that second spoiler. That's very typical in all the JavaScript that you're going to write. You're going to have an event that sort of kicks things off. In this case, the event is the onClick event. That means when the user clicks this button. What do we want to do? We want to change the style of a particular thing on the page. So we use the DOM to point to that thing on the page. On the document, the thing that has an element, the thing that has an ID of spoiler 1, we want to change its style. We want to change the display. We want to make it block. And we can do some other things too, right? We can change colors of the page. Or change colors to sections of the page if we want to. We can point to anything on the page that we want to, and we can change its color. So I can create another button here. Change the color of the question. This changing the style display. I'll change the style. Background. Color. And we'll change it to yellow. Change color of that, and the color becomes yellow. So notice that if we want to change something in the style, we put the exact same thing that we would have put in to initially set it. All right. In other words, how do you set the color of something in CSS? Any paragraph with how do I set the color of this initially? By saying background dash color. I set that by CSS. How do I change it via JavaScript? Well, once I find the thing on the page, I say I want to change its style, then I say the property I want to change. The only difference is if there's a dash in the property, you eliminate the dash and makes the next letter capital. So instead of background dash color, it's background color with a capital C in color. So this will go and we'll change it from green to yellow. Now, we could make it to show not based on clicking, but based on putting our mouse over things. We're going to make a copy of this. And we'll call it spoiler 2. And I'm not going to use the button click. I'm going to use a different event. We get rid of the button. Well, I'm going to copy this snippet of code right here. Then I'm going to get rid of buttons. Background color. I'm going to change it so if they put their mouse over the paragraph, it changes it. So what am I changing? I'm changing the method. Instead of clicking a button, when I put my mouse over the paragraph, I execute this code. So instead of on click, I'm going to say on mouse over. Document get element by ID, spoiler 1, find the thing on the page as an ID of spoiler 1, and change its style, the display attribute to block. My mouse over it, it appears. Let's do that slower. My mouse over it, it appears. It would be nice if I could hide it again by taking my mouse out of it, which I can absolutely do by saying on mouse out. I can make it hidden again. Display equals none. Mouse. Ooh, went wrong, right? We're getting into a more detailed programming language with JavaScript, which means that things go wrong a lot easier. So how do I know what went wrong? I could stare at the code and hope that I find the answer. In this case, there's an end paragraph there. An extra end paragraph got put in there. So it appears, it disappears. So on a much smaller scale, this is exactly what we have with ESPN. ESPN's on a much bigger scale. We make that appear, we make it disappear, appear, disappear. Here, we make it appear and disappear, appear and disappear. Now, if we want to do that to the other paragraph, we could do it and we would just change this to spoiler 2. Maybe. Oh, I pasted over content. Make them appear and disappear based on where we move the mouse. Now, JavaScript is very picky with its rules. HTML and CSS are far less picky. Like, for instance, if I made this paragraph a capital P, it would still work, right? If I made this section a capital S-E lowercase t-i-o-n, it would still work, all right? HTML is not case sensitive, but JavaScript is. So if I make a small mistake like this and say document get element by ID and capitalize the D, all of a sudden, the page doesn't work. Now, again, as I mentioned before, you can look at the code and try to figure out what's wrong. A very useful tool is if you look at the JavaScript console. And if you're running Google Chrome, if you go under More Tools, Developer Tools, and look at the console, it'll give you an idea what's wrong. Unfortunately, not always does it give you a precise description of what's wrong. Sometimes you have to read between the lines. But at least this gives you a fighting chance at figuring out what the error is. So in this case, it says document.getElement by ID is not a function. So if you saw that, you'd think, well, wait a minute, we went over that in class. Go and review the notes, maybe Google it, and you'd find that there is a lowercase d in getElement by ID. If I mess up and spell style wrong, accidentally. Doesn't work. What's the error I get? Cannot set property of undefined. Setting display. What that means is it doesn't know what style is, S-T-Y-L. So that's undefined to JavaScript because you spelled style wrong. It takes a little bit of time before you can decipher some of these error messages. But I want you to get in the habit of looking at them because at least it can sort of give you a nudge in the right direction as to what the problem is. And you can always ask me if you get an error that you can't figure out. Make sure it still works now. There we go. I have some other JavaScript examples online that do a similar thing. I'll zip up and post this folder after class. One of them, menu 1, shows how you might have a menu where you put your mouse over that, the submenu appears. Look at that. That's very similar to what we've done before. We have a mouse over event that says, find the submenu and display it. I'll be going over this example as well as some other example like this image swap example in upcoming weeks over the next 2 weeks. After today, we have 2 more weeks of lectures. So I'll be covering more JavaScript examples next week. And we'll see how far we get. It's possible the following week, we'll decide what we're going to do the following week. But definitely next week, I'll cover more JavaScript examples. Take the time to review these JavaScript examples that I put out there. And we will go over them, bring whatever questions that you have to class. Are there any questions now? One point I do want to make clear, JavaScript is not the same as Java. I've heard people talk about putting Java on their web pages, and while that is possible, usually they mean that they put JavaScript on their web pages. Java is used as a server-side scripting technology, and JavaScript can be used either on the server or the client. So usually if they're talking about client-side processing, they're talking about JavaScript. All right, that's all I had for today. If there are no further questions, we'll see you next week.